Hello everyone, my name is David Barfknecht and I am a PhD student at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, and I am a PhD student in the Gibson Plant Ecology Lab. And today I will be discussing some of the research that I've been conducting based on the metapopulation and metacommunity structure in sandstone outcrop communities, particularly within Southern Illinois. So as I said, this is part of a larger group of projects, and my previous research actually focused on a larger and more diverse grouping of natural xeric forest opening communities that were not just based on sandstone substrate, but other substrates such as shale and loess and other substrates. But my this project required sites that were a little bit more closer together in order to realistically consider that they were potentially sharing individuals between them in a patch-like network. And so this general network, while some of them are quite close, altogether they were far too distant from each other to be considered necessarily metapopulations or metacommunities. So I decided to focus my efforts to an area in northwestern Pope County in extreme southern Illinois to look at these metapopulation and metacommunity structures. And the site that I chose to do for this kind of research was the sandstone outcrops that occurred at Jackson Hollow Nature Preserve along Trig Tower Road. And I think it's pretty easy to tell from this image that most of these sandstone outcrop communities are actually quite visible, and this is imagery from about 200 feet up that's been stitched together using orthomosaics, and you can see there are several spots here where it's very evident that there are distinct xeric openings that exist within an adjacent hardwood forest matrix that you can see takes up a large majority of this preserve. And so, backing out a little bit to talk about a little bit of the background related to this is that since the 1800s and close to the time of the peak of European settlement in most of the areas of the Midwest, the Illinois grassland and other related habitats largely had reductions in both their quality and their quantity due to agricultural practices as well as fire suppression, mostly due to anthropogenetic sources that led to their overall degradation, as well as since fire suppression allowed for basically woody encroachment that allowed for a lot of these xeric patches to actually gain enough woody vegetation that the openings themselves eventually closed up. And so the few that do exist and that were not actually utilized by settlers at that point remain as natural xeric forest opening communities. And in this case, we're focusing on the sandstone ones. But it's an important aspect of these to understand how to preserve these natural habitats, to actually understand how this patch-like set of ecosystems actually shares not only species but the general community assemblies between them. So for this general talk, I'll be looking at how patch dynamics and metapopulation and metacommunity dynamics together influence community assembly, while my previous research looked at a lot of these other cells with this diagram you see here. So moving on from that, it's important to define what exactly is the difference between a metapopulation and a metacommunity, because a lot of people tend to think that a metacommunity is just several metapopulations that together kind of go in between sites. And while there are different perspectives of metacommunity, such as local dynamics theory that look at this, there are different theories. But the general gist of this concept is that metapopulations are groups of separated local populations that interact between each other, not between births and deaths at a local site, but the immigration and emigration of individuals within each local site to other sites. And so you can see at the top left diagram here once things are able to transverse into a regional and local species pool, different local species pools or local sites can have individuals exchanged at a regional level depending on how close they are and how well the dispersal ability of the organism is. In a meta-community sense, this is broadened to not only include a larger scope compared to a traditional community, but other than dispersal, like with a metapopulation, there's other considerations that are thought about with meta-communities, such as patch heterogeneity due to differences of the environmental conditions that occur in an individual site. But there's also interspecific interactions that are based on how different species interact within local community assemblages. So this diagram, I think, is a really nice demonstration of that, because obviously the organization level, you're going from multiple populations to well, you're going from individual populations to a network of populations at a single site called species, but then you're going from a local site all the way over into a more regional area where there's patches of not only metapopulations but also entire metacommunities that are linked based on their dispersal connectivity, and they're affected at least in some way by the environmental heterogeneity. So for this experiment, the area that you saw before, there were several vegetation surveys that were conducted between 4 different months during the summer periods last year in these different open communities within the Jackson Hollow Nature Preserve. And within these sites, species that were both mosses and non-vasculars as well as vascular species were recorded based on their occurrence in areas that were specifically less than 50% canopy cover. And so that was actually judged using this device here called a densiometer, where we actually counted along the margins where high levels of light were if there was a species in question, but most of these areas were quite distinct. And then we not only recorded species that occurred within these openings, but we also walked several areas within the adjacent forest matrix to figure out which species were not only occurring within the patches, but that were also occurring in this adjacent forest matrix. To develop a map of this area, I was lucky enough to actually get the University of Illinois Extension Office to help me with some maps of ortho mosaics built off of drone imagery to actually map out the site. And this yellow polygon here is actually the total site of the part of the Jackson Hollow Nature Preserve that I studied. And this is one of the flights, but you can kind of see how the drone does these transects. But to add more confidence to where I was actually doing my surveys, I manually recorded, the edges of each patch using a handheld GPS, and then re-layered that onto the ortho mosaics once they were stitched together in ArcGIS to create a discrete map of suitable patches of sandstone outcrop communities. And so this is kind of what happened. Again, we have this image here, and it's very easy to see all these sites, but then once you use the handheld GPS as well as the drone imagery together, it's very easy to see that there were 23 separate sites at this side of the nature preserve that all varied very greatly in their area perimeter and their area to perimeter ratio, sometimes by a difference in magnitude of 3. And while I do believe that area and perimeter are quite self-explanatory in this case, area to perimeter is a metric that has to do with shape regularity. And so at the highest value of area to perimeter ratio, you're going to have something close to what would be considered a perfect circle, where you'd have virtually no patch irregularity, where a more linear and jagged system would actually tend to have a lower value. So for example, a low value in here would be considered something like K, or in this case even like D, which is actually, those two are pretty hard to see, but they're very small communities that also are highly irregular. And area to perimeter ratio itself is a very, very important characteristic for defining and figuring out what drives based on patch dynamics, what actually influences the dispersal of individuals between local suitable sites. So that's important. So here are some of the larger contenders of the group, and this is the smaller one. And so these two larger sites here, S and T, as you can tell, are way over here, and they also tend to have higher area to perimeter ratios, and they also tend to, of course, based on geometry, have higher perimeters since they have larger areas. And the smallest site is D, which is actually right here, which honestly, you can't really see too much past the actual D itself. So yeah, so there's a large variation of different sites here. And so for the actual metapopulation analysis, I chose to use a Hanske's incidence function model, which is a spatially explicit, species-specific model that allows for the incorporation of things like patch area, shape, and isolation, which in this case is distance from one another based on their centroids. And this is quite different from some other metapopulation models, even though it's quite itself is quite popular, because traditional local dynamics models usually assume more of a classic Levin's metapopulation approach, and this is actually a pretty poor representation because that model assumes that sites are equal sizes as well as equal distances from one another, which, as we know, based on a biological perspective, isn't very accurate. And instead, there are more situations like this where you have, for example, mainland island, which is like the theory of island biogeography by MacArthur and Wilson, where you have one large island contributing species to every smaller island, but you can also have patchwork, intermediate cases where an aggregate of several small patches is acting as the source of species abundance as well as genetic diversity to other rescue patches and so on and so forth. And so for the meta-community analysis, I chose to use a Liebel-Michelson framework because it uses three different very distinct metrics to actually judge the meta-community structure based on 6 different potential structures, as you can see here. And those 3 different structures are based on species coherence, absolute species turnover, as well as boundary clumping based on Morista's index, which is an index that looks at dispersion of individuals across sites. And altogether, when you do this framework, it also generates an interaction matrix between species and patches where you have ordered species here and then ordered sites here based on a pre-designated order, and then species across the x-axis based on their centroid of occurrence. And so you end up with these where the black dots are the black squares are actually the occurrence of species. And so to just explain this just a little bit further, this acts as a framework where you first calculate coherence, which is based on the number and occurrence of embedded absences within a community data set compared to a null randomized model. And so if you have either negative or non-significant, there's no true actual metapopulation structure. You either have overdispersion of species across the matrix, or you have more of a null model where the occurrence of species is more random. Now, if you have positive coherence, you can have differences in turnover where you can have nested, where this would be more of a system where there's a core site that contributes species to and somehow ordered subset of sites, either in a nested session or based on boundary clumping. This is again the case where it's not significant or positive. If you have not very well boundary clumping, you'd have a more gradual exchange of species across a set of sites. And then the ones that are most talked about, especially within our college level ecology classes, are the Gleasonian and the Clementsian models, where Gleasonian is a regular gradient of species distributions across adjacent sites, whereas Clemensian is a little bit more clumped based on Marista's index. So that those two are the ones that are largely talked about in ecological literature as well. And these ones are a little bit more uncommon, but altogether they are definitely possible. And then finally, since we have a low number of total sites, I chose to go with correlation analysis, a Spearman's rank correlation analysis, looking at total species richness, the total number of species within the site that exhibited metapopulation dynamics based on Hanske's incidence function model, the area of the site perimeter, and then the area to perimeter ratio, which again is looking at the shape regularity of an individual site. So moving on a little bit to the results of the analysis, as you can see here, there were a large variety of different organisms based on evolutionary background, including 6 mosses, 7 ferns or manilophytes, 2 gymnosperms, 28 monocotyledons, and 85 eudicotyledons. And so the overall number of species that were observed to actually have metapopulation dynamics was actually a pretty relatively low number of species compared to the total, 20 out of 128 species. And what's interesting about this is that several of the species that had some kind of metapopulation dynamic were grouped into certain families or certain designations. So for example, 4 of the total 20 species actually ended up being within the composites or the Asteraceae family, as well as the blue here represents Gramanoids that occurred. So the Cyperaceae, the sedges, and Poaceae, the grasses, there were 5 of those that actually occurred within the metapopulation dynamic significant group as well. And then finally, 5 out of 6 of the exotic invasive species that were observed across all surveys ended up having significant metapopulation dynamics. The only thing that didn't actually make this list was Lonicera japonica, which is known as Japanese honeysuckle. But for example, Cerastium Fontainum, which is mouse ear chickweed, Lespedeza cuneata, and a lot of these are pretty noxious invasive weeds, essentially. So going through these with a little bit of pictures, I don't think common ragweed needs much of an introduction, but here's a picture. It's a member of Asteraceae. It's a common roadside weed that doesn't actually have very conspicuous flowers, and it's seen across sites, and most people deem it as a noxious weed, but it actually truly is a native plant. Bidem pinnata, which is another 5-petaled Asteraceae species that occurs largely in shaded woodland areas, but in this case it was largely within the drier open areas. Lactuca hirsuta sanguinea actually is pretty interesting because most lactucas actually don't have a salmon colored flower. This is actually a rare variety of that flower that was observed in at least 5 or 6 of the original Jackson Hollow sites, and it also has like a hairy stem and hairy leaves. But most lactucas either have a white or a yellow flower to my recollection, while this one is a very distinct group that is pretty well defined to the southern end of Illinois. And then again, Solidago canadensis. There were other Solidagos that occurred in this area, including Solidago cassia and Solidago nemoralis. But Solidago canadensis itself was observed largely within natural xeric forest openings compared to the inland adjacent forest matrix, where cassia and nemoralis tended to be more abundant. Again, goldenrod doesn't need much of an introduction, but there are several different species of that, of course. Moving on to the Gramanoids, uh, Clerixcocodia is a very glaucous, as you can tell by the name sedge, that has this very bluish white cuticle on the outside that makes it very distinctive from a lot of other sedges. And here is an example of the inflorescence of that plant. And then that's the Cyperaceae that had metapopulation dynamics. And then these three are the grasses. Poa sylvestris, which actually did occur at the eastern end of the extent of these, and then mostly within A, B, C, and D, and E of the original extent of the um, of the patches. Chasmanthium latifolium, also known as river oats, which is typically a very common dry upland wood grass species, actually wasn't too common inside of the adjacent forest matrix, but particularly like to occur close to or next to the edge of sandstone outcrops. And then Danthonia spicata, which based on previous research likes open dry habitats, but is also an indicator species for a lot of shale barrens. In this case, the largest abundance of this species was found in the actual open sandstone outcrop communities, and it's got a very distinct senescence where it has this very curly remnant leaves that persist throughout most of the year. So even if the plant itself is not very active, it's very easy to tell where it occurs throughout the year. And then finally getting on to the exotic species, and I understand this is an indigenous plant symposium, but I don't think we can talk too much about indigenous species without looking at the exotics as well. Cerastium Fontainum is a mouse ear chickweed. It's usually an extremely prevalent agricultural weed. It's usually not super noxious in natural systems, but in this case it did seem to have some spotty distribution enough to consider it a metapopulation. Lespedeza cuneata, Cercia lespedeza, is a legume-based species that's been known to create very dense monocultures within open prairie communities due to its allelopathic and shading out abilities. Not too much different in its invasion strategy to microstegium, but microstegium is a grass that, interesting enough, not only has C4 photosynthetic capabilities, but it actually has 3 modes of reproduction, including outcrossing flowers, cleistogamic flowers that can enable it to basically self-breed, as well as if you have an intercalary meristem clipped off of a plant, that can actually result in cloning. So cutting this thing with a mower might actually be helping it. So these two in general are very, very difficult to deal with in open systems. Rosa Maltiflora is more famously known as, again, Multiflora Rose, and this is actually something that I've seen more common in forested systems or along the edge of forest systems. But one way to distinguish it from a native variety is that right here it has this very frilly stipular area. These stipules would be more entire if it was a native rose. So this is a great way to tell this invasive from native plants. And then finally, Verbasymthapsis, which is a biennial Scropherilaceae member. It usually starts as a small rosette, and the second year it will bolt into this brilliant yellow structure, and then it will eventually die off. But this one isn't as much of an invasive as it is an exotic, but it was a significant metapopulation. Moving on to the Liebel and Michelson framework-based elements. All 3 of them had highly significant values that showed that the coherence itself at least pointed towards it having some kind of a significant metapopulation structure that was different from a checkerboard or a random assembly based on the species and sites matrix. The turnover was positive within it, indicating some kind of structure here as opposed to nested subsets. And then based on a positive Morris's I index, it showed that these sites tend to have somewhat of a Clementsian metapopulation structure, which is typically characterized by positive turnover, which is evident, and clumped boundaries, again, which is evident, and then several ubiquitous species across the entire site. And then I actually generated that matrix, and I think it's pretty easy to tell. Again, remember that black here is the occurrence of a species, which is our x-axis, and y here I chose to organize based on sites from where I started to finish. A lot of these species go all the way across the board, so there's several ubiquitous species that characterize these environments. But there's also this very clumped nature, this boxy nature that points to positive boundary clumping. But there's regular replacement, which is where we get kind of this trend, this slope in the overall interaction matrix. And if any of us remember back to our ecology classes in college or whatever, is that Clementsian structures are based on Clementsian succession, which is a directional form of succession where earlier successional pioneer ruderal species originally colonize an area, and then over time, as they modify the environment as well as each other, they are slowly replaced by later successional and better competitive species such as hardwoods, which is shown here. But in this case, due to the low substrate availability as well as low water and high light, there might not be suitable conditions for a lot of these hardwood species to necessarily become abundant. So it might be stuck more in an earlier stage where those species are more considered, in this case, relatively late term successional. And so again, just looking at the original diagram we looked at, just to compare it with the one that was generated, you can see that clumpiness, and again, this is a perfect Clementsian structure, so it doesn't look perfect, but you can definitely see where they share certain characteristics. And then moving on to the Spearman's rank correlations, this is again a non-parametric rank-based correlation, and all of these features here are total species richness of all species, species that exhibited the metapopulation dynamic. So the 20, if there's the occurrence of one of the 20 some species in the site, it's counted. The total area of a site, the perimeter, and then again the patch shapeliness, which is area to perimeter ratio. So there's a few things to notice here, and I think that this one doesn't come as a surprise to many people, is that the patch characteristics are all positively correlated with each other. I don't think it's surprising that area and perimeter from a simple geometric point of view are correlated, because the larger shape you have, the more area you have, and therefore you also have typically a larger perimeter regardless necessarily of shape size. But I think the fact that area and perimeter ratio also increases points to the fact that larger shapes tend to also be more regularly shaped. And I think that's very important for restoration ecology, to realize that smaller, potentially more diminished patches typically also have very irregular edges, and that's often particularly quite important for how many invasive species actually invade a certain area from an adjacent forest matrix, or whatever adjacent community is within them that holds those invasive species. And so moving on to total species richness, compared to the species area relationship, this is a case where it actually doesn't apply in this patchy network, where most of the patch characteristics such as area perimeter and area to perimeter ratio don't really correlate necessarily with the total amount of species that occur within a site. However, the total number of species and the total number of species that exhibit metapopulation dynamics are actually quite highly positively correlated, which means that the total number of species that occur within a site also means that there's more species within that site that is sharing metapopulation communities with adjacent sites. And then finally, so for example, here, species that exhibit metapopulation dynamics typically also have at least a weak positive correlation with area, which you'd expect that with total species, but in this case it's with just species that have metapopulation dynamics. Again, area and perimeter tend to be weakly positively correlated with that, but with area to perimeter ratio, there's not a significant positive relationship between that. So it's possible that species that exhibit these dynamics are not selective to sites based on their irregularity of shape. And in adjacent, I think it's also important to point out here that this is a symmetric graph, so that's why things are circled at the same time across the graph. So I've had questions, so I just want to address that right away. And so here's just a little bit more detailed image of that, where the top again is those dynamics based on the significance of them with the asterisks, and then the bottom part of the lower left-hand part of this is actually the dot plots. So you can see, for example, some of these really highly correlative ones are quite strong, where again, for example, this area to perimeter ratio with total species richness is actually quite janky, and it's very flat. So this is just a more convoluted, I guess, way to share that. And then here is the total species, as well as species that are present that have metapopulation dynamics. And so I just kind of wanted to point out the areas here for future restoration efforts that I think are worth preserving, saving. And part of them are the ones that are largest and closest to the road, it seems. So the areas that have the largest total species, as well as the highest number of metapopulation species, tended to be larger and closer roads, such as A and B down here. E, which again is directly adjacent to the road. L, which is this really long shape that's a little further away from the road, but tends to have a relatively larger amount of metapopulation species. And I think that site's particularly important because it bridges a large gap between the lower grouping of sites and the more northerly grouping of sites. And then T was specifically high in this group of patches for its total number of species and high number of metapopulation species. I also think it's interesting because it looks like a little seahorse, but that's just me. So for a discussion here, most frequent species that were actually observed, and this isn't necessarily within the matrix that was showed, the species site interaction matrix, were actually tree species that were not directly observed in the adjacent hardwood forest matrix. And so what you're seeing off on your right hand side here are just some representations that your common juniper was pretty much largely confined to the open xeric sandstone outcrop communities, as well as Pinus echinata, which technically it's naturalized as opposed to an exotic, so that's why I didn't classify it as an exotic. And then these two xeric oak species, Quercus stellata as well as Quercus marylandica. Other adjacent forest matrix species may not be able to colonize some of these areas due to the physiological hurdle that they require that the species has to be able to overcome, such as the dry conditions with low water, or the really high light, or the very large lack of substrate, because several areas within these sites are just bare sandstone. So there's not really a developed soil that a lot of plants can actually develop roots into. Other ubiquitous species that were present within the adjacent forest matrix also tended to also be within the sites, and vice versa. And so while they were analyzed for metapopulation dynamics, all of these species failed the significance test for the incidence function model, which means they're not considered metapopulations. So the list I presented earlier are species that were not necessarily directly observed in the hardwood adjacent matrix, and they're truly acting as patch-like populations. And this is actually one of the first studies in this direct area that looks at the metapopulation dynamics of non-vascular moss species, of which none of them actually seem to have shown any kind of metapopulation dynamic. And it's fair to say some of these species are quite ubiquitous, and the model that's used actually downweights it, the potential for it being a metapopulation if it's ubiquitous across every single site. But either way, all 6 of the non-vascular species failed that model for significance. And then finally, a small subset of the species that were observed within these communities actually had metapopulation dynamics. And this is really small and points towards at least some kind of a subset of the community actually exhibiting some kind of a dispersal. And since there's such few species that exhibit metapopulation dynamics, this might be due to the fact that the adjacent hardwood forest matrix greatly limits the dispersal ability of these sites, and the relative distance between suitable sites for certain species is quite distance intensive for them to be able to spread it without the aid of some kind of reliable pollination or dispersal vector. Relating back to sites, sites which had high numbers of total species richness as well as high numbers of species which had metapopulation dynamics were often larger based on area and perimeter here, excuse my typo, and were often closer to the road westward of the preserve. And again, these were composites, grasses, sedges, and then a lot of exotic species. And this might mean that there's some kind of an additive or interactive response, not only due to the total area available at an individual site, but there might be some kind of impact related to anthropogenetic disturbance. And then finally, as said before, there's a Clementsian structure because based on the original description by Liebold and Michelson themselves, Clementsian metacommunities typically have several ubiquitous species across the patch-like network. A positive coherence value means that there are no checkerboard or overdispersion, as well as null-based random assemblages of species. There's also regular positive replacements where if a species is taken out of one community, the next community replaces it with a different species. And then finally, there's a clump distribution of species across individual sites, and all these together strongly point to at least some form of a Clementsian metacommunity structure. So finally, I would like to thank several people who helped with this research, including my PhD committee, including Dr. Gibson, my PI, Dr. Newbig, Sipes, Brown, and Holzmuller. Field assistance from several wonderful people, including Suraj Thapa, Ava Alford, Nick Seaton, Kevin Rowling. The last 2 were from Illinois Extension or other agencies, and then Sam Ramirez. Suraj helped again with data assistance. I got some funding from the Illinois Native Plant Society to do this project, which was mostly used for gas and materials. And I'd like to thank some other people for either emotional or intellectual support, including the Southern Illinois University Plant Biology Department. These other 2 agencies, the Illinois Native Species Commission, as well as the Shawnee National Forest, and all of you who are willing to take part of your busy afternoons to hear me babble about my research. And I would like to thank all of you for showing up. And here's some nice pictures at the end of my presentation that were taken at the site. So this is Sam Ramirez helping me record plants as I call them out. This is Opuntia cespitosa, which is a local cactus that's different from Opuntia humifusa, which is a little bit more common. This is Femoranthes parviflora, which is actually a state-threatened species that occurs at several of the individual patches across my site. And then this last little image here is Nick Seaton helping me with my drone surveys, and here's a picture of the drone before and after it returned from the project. And so thank you very much, and I encourage and welcome any reasonable questions. Have a good day.